The Ely and Littleport riots of 1816, also known as the Ely riots or Littleport riots, occurred between 22 and 24 May 1816 in Littleport, Cambridgeshire. The riots were caused by high unemployment and rising grain costs, much like the general unrest which spread throughout England following the Napoleonic Wars. The Littleport riot broke out when a group of residents met at the Globe Inn. Fueled by alcohol, they left the inn and began intimidating wealthier Littleport residents, demanding money and destroying property. The riot spread to Ely, where magistrates attempted to calm the protests by ordering poor relief and fixing a minimum wage. See printed bill. The following day, encouraged by Lord Liverpool's government, a militia of the citizens of Ely, led by Sir Henry Bate Dudley and backed by the Royal Dragoons, rounded up the rioters. In the ensuing altercation at the George and Dragon in Littleport, a trooper was injured, one rioter was killed, and at least one went on the run. Edward Christian, brother of Fletcher Christian, had been appointed Chief Justice of the Isle of Ely in 1800 by the Bishop of Ely. As the Chief Justice, Christian was entitled to try the rioters alone. The government, in this case via the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, nevertheless appointed a special commission, consisting of Justice Abbott and Justice Burrow. The rioters were tried in the assizes at Ely during the week commencing June 1816. 23 men and 1 woman were condemned, of which 5 were subsequently hanged. General unrest and riots such as that at Littleport may have been a factor in the government passing the Vagrancy Act of 1824 and subsequently the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. Background. In 1815, the government increased taxation on imported wheat and grain to help pay for the costs of the Napoleonic Wars. Poor laws, such as the Speenham land system, were designed to help alleviate financial distress of the poorer communities, but such systems helped to keep wages artificially low, as the farmers' new laborious wages would be supplemented by the system. Basic commodities, like cereals and bread, became heavily overpriced, creating widespread social unrest. The worst hit were the families of the men returning from the Battle of Waterloo, who arrived home at a time when unemployment was already high. One reply to a questionnaire circulated by the Board of Agriculture in February, March, and April 1816 reported that the state of the laboring poor is very deplorable and arises entirely from the want of employment, which they are willing to seek, but the farmer cannot afford to furnish. In early 1816, a quarter of wheat cost 52 shillings, rising through 76 shillings in May to 103 shillings in December. Average wages for the period remained static at 8 to 9 shillings per week. In 1815, a pound of bread was quoted at over 4 shillings and predicted to rise to over 5 shillings. Rioting. Preceding events in the region. There was rioting in the first months of 1816 in West Suffolk, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire. On the 16th of May, riots broke out in Bury St Edmunds and Brandon in West Suffolk, and also in Hockwell, Feldwell and Norwich in Norfolk. On the morning of the 20th of May, a meeting was held in Southery, Norfolk. The group, including a Thomas Sindel, marched through Denver to Downham Market to meet with the magistrates at the weekly meeting at the Crown Public House. Sindel was the only person known to have been at both the riots at Downham Market and Littleport. He was killed by troopers at Littleport. See below. The mob of 1,500, mainly men but some women, besieged the Crown until the magistrates agreed to allow a deputation of of 8 rioters inside to make the pleas to have work and 2 shillings per day. The magistrates acceded to these demands, but they had already called the yeoman cavalry from Upwell, who arrived at 5 p.m. Backed by the troops, the Riot Act was then read in the marketplace by Reverend Daring, causing further tussles, which subsided after arrests started to be made. At the Norfolk and Norwich assizes in August, 9 men and 6 women were sentenced to death. 13 of those sentences were commuted, and 2 of the Downham rioters, Daniel Harwood and Thomas Thody, were hanged on the afternoon of the 31st of August 1816. Littleport is a large village in Cambridgeshire with a population in 1811 of 1,847. It is just under 11 miles south-southwest of Downham Market and just over 4 miles north-northeast of Ely. On the 22nd of May 1816, a group of 56 residents met at the Globe Inn.Littleport to discuss the lack of work and rising grain costs. Fueled by alcohol, the residents directed their anger at local farmer Henry Martin. He had been overseer of the poor in 1814 and was not well liked by the parishioners. One man went to get a horn from Burgess the lighterman and started blowing it outside the Globe Inn, gathering hundreds of villagers to join the first group, and the riot commenced. The rioters began at Minge's shop, where stones were thrown through the windows, and then they invaded Mr. Clark's property and threw his belongings into the street. Next, at Josiah Dewey's place, the Reverend John Vatchell and his wife arrived to try to calm the rioters. The Vatchell had been vicar of St. George's since 1795 and was also a magistrate. He was an unpopular man, as he dealt harshly with even minor offences. He tried to read the Riot Act without effect, as the crowd told him to go home. The rioters next visited the premises of disabled 90-year-old Mr. Sindel, throwing his furniture into the street. His housekeeper, Mrs. Hutt, was intimidated by a rioter wielding a butcher's cleaver. After stopping at the place of Mr. Little, a nice old gentleman, who gave the mob £2, they continued to rob at Speechley's and demolished his furniture. Next they broke into the house of Rebecca Wadlow looking for Harry Martin, her grandson. He had seen them coming and escaped out the back. Rebecca Cutlack was visiting her at the time, and they robbed her and removed property worth between £100 and £200. At about 11 p.m., the rioters arrived at the house of the Reverend John Vatchell, who, after threatening to shoot anyone who entered his house, was disarmed when 3 men rushed him. He fled on foot with his wife and 2 daughters towards Ely. After Vatchell had left, the rioters destroyed his goods and chattels and stole some of his silverware. The Vatchell was later to sue the 100 of Ely for the damages under the Riot Act. He received over £708, an award which was challenged in the press, as many people complained about the size of the resulting district levies used to pay for it. The rioters then stopped a post-chaise returning with Hugh Robert Evans Sr. and Henry Martin from a Turnpike Trust meeting in Downham. They robbed Evans of 14 shillings before allowing them both to proceed. On reaching Ely, Evans alerted the magistrates, who sent a carriage for Reverend Vatchell, which collected him and his family walking towards Ely. Ely, Cambridgeshire, is a city with an 1811 population of 4,249 people. The city is nearly 15 miles north-northeast of Cambridge and 67 miles north-northeast of London. When Vatchell arrived in Ely, he alerted fellow clergymen and magistrates Reverend William Metcalfe and Reverend Henry Law, who dispatched Thomas Archer as a messenger to Bury, 26 miles to the east. The rioters in Littleton had in the interim stolen a wagon and horses from Henry Tansley and equipped it with fowling guns front and back. Most of the Littleton mob, armed with guns and pitchforks, then began the march to Ely, arriving 3/4 of a mile north of the city between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. on the 23rd of May. The Reverend William Metcalfe met them, read the Riot Act, and asked what the mob required. On being told that they wanted the price of a stone of flour per day, and that "our children are starving, give us a living wage," the Reverend agreed, but stated that he would have to converse with the other magistrates. He asked everyone to return to Littleport, but they marched on. Metcalfe implored them to go to the marketplace, and many did go there, where they were joined by Ely citizens. Recognizing the needs of the rioters, the Ely magistrates, the Reverends William Metcalfe, Peploe Ward and Henry Law, drafted a response, offering poor families 2 shillings per head per week and ordering farmers to pay 2 shillings per day wages. On hearing the proclamation, the mob cheered. The magistrates then gave the men some beer, told them not to get drunk, and tried to persuade them to go home. Some took the advice, whilst others continued the rampage, intimidating shopkeepers, millers and bankers and stealing from some. However, most of the rioters, marching with the wagons and guns, left the city for Littleport before the arrival of the military from Bury. Meanwhile, the magistrates delegated Henry Law to go to London to discuss the matter with Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary. On the way, Law stopped at the barracks of the Royston troop of volunteer yeomanry cavalry and requested they go to Ely. Law was unable to convince Sidmouth of the seriousness of the situation, and Sidmouth asked Reverend Sir Henry Bate Dudley to return with Law and report on the matter. Restoring order, a detachment of 18 men of the 1st the Royal Dragoons, commanded by Captain Methuen, arrived in Ely from Bury on the 23rd of May in the late afternoon. They marched through the streets as a show of force, remaining all night. The following afternoon, the 24th of May, the troops marched on Littleport, led by Sir Henry Bate Dudley and John Bacon, a Bow Street constable. They were followed by the Royston troop of volunteer yeomanry cavalry summoned earlier by Henry Law, and a militia of gentlemen and inhabitants of Ely. Before arrival at the Ely road, a small detachment of troops were ordered across the hemmed field to enter the village from the east. A larger group then charged at a hard gallop down the Mill Street incline through to Main Street. The rioters were found making a stand in the George and Dragon near the west end of Station Road. The militia were called to the front when the rioters would not come out after being ordered to by Bate Dudley. Thomas South, shooting from a window, hit Trooper Wallace in the forearm. The militia got the rioters out of the public house and assembled them in the street, surrounded by the troopers. Thomas Sindel attempted to take a musket from Trooper William Porter but was not successful. Sindel ran away, and when he did not stop after being called on to by Porter, he was shot through the back of the head. Thomas Sindel was killed. He was the only person known to be at both Downham Market and Littleport. The result of this shooting was to subdue the rest of the rioters. Those captured were taken to Ely jail and the rest of the rioters were rounded up. The Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, had dispatched 3 troops of cavalry, 2 6-pounder cannons and 3 companies of the 69th Regiment of Foot under Major General Byng to help capture the leading rioters. 2 rioters were hidden in Lakenheath by a labourer who eventually betrayed them for £5 each. One rioter, William Gotobt, a bricklayer, escaped and was eventually pardoned a few years later. He returned to Littleport after 7 years and then went to America. The rioting spread to nearby areas such as Little Downham, Cambridgeshire, although such areas were not as badly affected. It took until the 10th of June before the areas were finally cleared of trouble and all of the rioters had been captured. Trial. The assizes for the 82 persons, 73 of whom were in prison and 9 on bail, lasted from Monday the 17th of June 1816 through to the following Saturday. Special Commission. Since 970 AD, and until 1837, the Bishop of Ely retained exclusive jurisdiction in civil and criminal matters, and was also keeper of the records. As part of this right, the bishop appointed a Chief Justice of the Isle of Ely. Edward Christian had held the post since 1800. In these special assizes, the Crown, via Lord Sidmouth, created a special commission. Sidmouth appointed 2 judges, Mr. Justice Abbott and Mr. Justice Burrow, to preside over it. Christian, nevertheless, felt he should attend, and indeed was in attendance throughout. After the trial, Christian said, "It was suggested to me in London that it would be more conducive to the great object of the commission if I declined my rotation of duty, and left the trial of all the prisoners to them." Monday, shortly after 10 a.m., the 3 judges went to the courthouse in the marketplace at the time, and the special commission was read. The judges then breakfasted at the bishop's palace, after which a service was held in the cathedral and attended by 50 of the principal inhabitants of Ely. The sermon, preached by Henry Bate Dudley, was that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient. After the service, around 1 p.m., the court reconvened. The grand jury was sworn in, and Mr. W. Dunn Gardner elected the foreman. Mr. Gurney, Mr. Bolland and Mr. Richardson were counsel for the Crown, led by Mr. William Hobhouse, Treasury Solicitor. For the defence, Mr. Hunt was counsel for Jefferson, Wybrow, Harley, Pricker, Cooper, Freeman and Jessup. Mr. Hart was counsel for John Easy, Joseph Easy, Benton, Leighton, Atkin, Hobbs and another. Mr. Justice Abbott addressed the court. "Gentlemen of the grand jury, you have been called together at this unusual period, and with the present solemnities, in consequence of some very daring acts of outrage committed by various misguided individuals in this town and its immediate neighborhood, which must still be fresh in your recollection. In contemplating the nature of these atrocities, it is impossible to consider without commendation the conductors of those prompt and efficacious measures by which, after it had dominated for several days together, the spirit of tumult and devastation was finally subdued." He then went on to direct the jury at length, commenting at one point that these disturbances seem to have been the necessity of an advance in the wages of husbandry, but the circumstances of some among the offenders do not correspond with the supposition of such an object. He was probably referring to John Dennis, licensed victualler of Littleport. He outlined the 3 capital offences that would be presented, namely burglary, robbery from the person and stealing in a dwelling house. He defined burglary as breaking into a house at night with intent, robbery from the person as extortion by violence or threat thereof, and stealing in a dwelling house as an actual act of stealing, not just the threat. He reminded the jury that when offences are carried out by a mob, it is the whole mob that is guilty, not just the person doing the deed. He closed, "It is of the highest importance to the peace and safety, not only of this isle, but of the surrounding country, that all who are present on this solemn inquiry, and all who read the account of its proceedings may be convinced by the awful lesson which may here be taught, that whatever wilder chimerical notions may prevail of the power of an armed multitude, the law is too strong for its assailants, and that, however triumphant or destructive the sway for a few days, those who defy the law will ultimately be compelled to submit either to its justice or its mercy." The court adjourned until the following day, Tuesday. On Tuesday, the 18th of June, the court opened at 9 a.m. 12 defendants were charged with breaking into the house of Rebecca Wadlow in Littleport and stealing personal property and money. After hearing evidence, the judges held a discussion. Mr. Justice Abbott informed the jury that the mistake had been made in the indictment, directing the jury to acquit. All 12 defendants were pronounced not guilty. 7 defendants were then indicted for breaking into the house of Josiah Dewey in Littleport, stealing money and property, and assaulting Dewey. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury. 3 witnesses testified. The jury recorded a verdict of guilty against Cheval, Easy, Jessup, South and Benton. Dan and Torrington were acquitted. The court adjourned at 5 p.m. Wednesday. On Wednesday, the 19th of June, the court opened at 9 a.m. The indictment on 3 of the defendants was read for forcibly entering the house of Robert Speechley in Littleport and stealing personal property. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury, who later pronounced all defendants guilty. 5 defendants were then indicted for forcing the way in the house of Rev. John Vatchell in Littleport, threatening him and stealing £2. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury. 2 witnesses testified. A verdict of guilty was returned against Harley and Newell, whilst Warner and Stibbett were acquitted. 5 defendants were then indicted for stealing £50 from the house of Robert Edwards in Ely. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury at length, describing the events occurring in the town of Ely on the morning of the 23rd of May 1816. 8 witnesses were called. The jury returned guilty verdicts against Dennis, Jefferson, and Rutter. Hopkin and Camel were given not guilty verdicts. Thursday. On Thursday morning, the 20th of June, 2 defendants were indicted for stealing silverware from the home of Rev. J. Vatchell in Littleport, and 1 was charged with receiving the stolen goods. 4 witnesses called were Elizabeth Carter, following which Mr. Justice Burrow summed up. Lavender was pronounced guilty of the theft, and Bemis and Butcher received not guilty verdicts. John Galtrip was next, also indicted for stealing spoons at the vicarage. As the evidence was contradictory, Galtrip was acquitted by the jury. Next at the bar was William Bemis, indicted for highway robbery of Hugh Robert Evans of Ely. 2 witnesses were called. Mr. Justice Abbott summed up, and the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the prisoner Bemis. Then 9 defendants were charged with threatening W. Cooper of Ely and stealing from him. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury, explaining the circumstances of the disturbances carried out by the mob in Ely. 9 witnesses were called. Mr. Justice Abbott spoke to the jury for a long time. The jury retired for 15 minutes. On returning, it pronounced as guilty Dennis, Jessup, Atkin, Leighton, Hobbs, Pricker, Cooper, and Jefferson. It acquitted Freeman. 6 defendants were then charged with stealing from George Stevens in Ely. 3 witnesses were examined, following which Dennis, Leighton, Atkin, and Camel were all pronounced guilty by the jury. Capital convictions against Aaron Cheval and William Bemis for robbing Henry Tansley of 2 £1 notes were also returned by the jury. The court adjourned at 6 p.m. Friday. On Friday morning, the 21st of June, 7 prisoners were brought to the bar on a similar charge as on Tuesday. The prisoners all pleaded not guilty. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury, explaining that these were the same persons indicted on Tuesday for the same offense. He explained to the jury that the earlier indictment incorrectly described the house to be the property of Rebecca Wadlow, leading to the prisoners' acquittal. He also explained that in the original indictment, other persons had been charged, but as these other persons had since been convicted of capital offences, they had been removed from the indictment. The witnesses were all brought forward again and made the statements. They said much the same as previously, though this took much of the day. In summing up, Mr. Abbott went on a length, closing with the duty which it belonged to them to execute, confident that, from experience which the court had now of them, the verdict would be such as good sense would dictate, and the public justice of the country require. It took the jury 5 minutes to find Walker, Butcher and Crow guilty and Nicholas, Wilson and Jefferson not guilty. Brought to the bar next was Henry Benson, a farmer who was out on bail, charged with inciting to riot. Benson was held in surety for £400 plus 2 other sureties for £200 each. He was to appear for trial at the next assizes. Richard Cooper the elder and Richard Cooper the younger were also bound over to the next assizes. Father and son, William Bemis the elder and the younger, were then brought in and charged with assaulting and stealing from Robert Cheesewright the younger, of Littleport, in the Isle of Ely. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury. Mr. Burrows summed up and the jury gave the guilty verdict to both prisoners shortly after. Next, between 20 and 30 prisoners were brought to the bar and indicted for having committed various felonies and misdemeanors at Littleport on 22, 23, and 24 of May last. A few were put to the next assizes and the remainder chose to be tried immediately. Mr. Gurney addressed the jury explaining that His Majesty's government was keen not to put to the jury more cases than was necessary. If the prisoners now at the bar offered a small surety and remained on good behaviour, there would be no more said. Mr. Abbott spoke to the prisoners at length, finally demanding that each of them offer surety of £50 and fine 2 more sureties each of £10 or 1 more each of £20. Mr. Abbott then thanked the jury for the services. The court adjourned. Sentences Saturday. On Saturday the 22nd of June 1816, 6 men were acquitted, 10 were discharged, 36 were bailed, 23 men and 1 woman were condemned, of whom 18 men and the woman, Sarah Hobbs, had the sentences commuted. Of the 19 persons commuted, 9 were sentenced to penal transportation. 7 of those 9 sailed on the convict ship Sir William Bensley, which departed for New South Wales on the 9th of October 1816, captained by Louis Williams. Records exist for the following known to have sailed: James Newell, Richard Jessup, John Jefferson, Joseph Easy, Aaron Chevelle, all of Littleport and all transported for life. Richard Rutter of Littleport for 14 years, John Easy of Littleport for 7 years. 2 others were also sentenced to transportation for 7 years, Mark Benton and John Walker, both of Littleport. 10, including Sarah Hobbs, were committed to Ely jail for 12 months. 5 were from Littleport and 5, including Sarah Hobbs, were from Ely. The 5 condemned without commutation were all from Littleport. They were William Bemis the elder, shoemaker, for stealing from the persons of Henry Tansley and Robert Cheesewright, both of Littleport; George Crow, labourer, for stealing in the dwelling house of Rebecca Wadlow and Henry Martin, both of Littleport; John Dennis, a publican, for stealing from the persons of William Cooper, Robert Edwards, and George Stevens, all of Ely; Isaac Harley Jr., labourer, for stealing from the person of the Reverend John Vatchell, of Littleport, and Thomas South the younger, labourer, for stealing in the dwelling house of Josiah Dewey and Robert Speechley, both of Littleport. Execution on Friday 28th of June 1816 at 9 a.m. The condemned men, William Bemis, George Crow, John Dennis, Isaac Harley and Thomas South, were driven from the jail at Ely Marketplace in a black draped cart and 2 horses costing £5 5 accompanied by the bishop's jail chaplain, John Griffin, in a hired chaise and pair costing 13 shillings. In submitting his expenses on the 29th of June, Chief Bailiff F. Bagg noted, "We have no power of pressing a cart for the purpose, and 'tis a difficult matter to get one. People feel so much upon the occasion." The men arrived at the gallows at Parnellpit around 11 a.m., and were hanged after praying with the crowd for some time. Griffin was unofficially given the ropes, which cost £1 5s, after hanging, which he kept. He left a collection to his housekeeper, who sold them as a cure for sore throats. Following the hanging, the bodies were placed in coffins and displayed in a cottage in Jail Street, where many people came to visit. They were buried the next day in St. Mary's Church, Ely, with the vicar's blessing. As a warning to others, a stone plaque was installed on the west side of St. Mary's Church. It concludes, "May their awful fate be a warning to others." In 1816, there were a total of 83 people executed in England, 80 men, including the 5 Littleport rioters, and 3 women.